So hi Mr. Keddy. For my last journal entry, I thought I'll be doing something a bit different, which is why instead of talking about the characters as well as the theme to my novel, A Thousand Splendid Suns by Khaled Hosseini, I'll be talking about the setting as well as the moods to my novel. So just a little introduction about the setting of the novel, A Thousand Splendid Suns, is that it spends its entire plot in Afghanistan, where specifically in part 1 of the book, it takes place in a small village called Herat. But after Mariam's mother suicides and then she is sold off by her father Jalil to a man named Rasheed, they then move the story plot to Kabul because that's where Rasheed lives. So this is the main setting for parts 2, 3, and 4 of the book, Kabul City. But at one point there's actually another city we get introduced to, Murray, because that's where Lila, the other protagonist of the novel, and her entire family moves for a while. But then they eventually do return back to Kabul. So we do see that this book spends most of its time in Kabul. So for this entry, even though A Thousand Splendid Suns does mention various cities in Afghanistan, we will only be focusing our time on Kabul City, because this is where most of the plot of the book does develop, as we see that many characters meet, change, and impact the overall storyline. So for a better understanding of the setting, we do need to understand some societal views on certain topics such as women's rights in Kabul City. So just a little bit of a rundown. We see that women in this case have very little rights, as they're only treated as cleaners and cooks of the house, and their main purpose in society was to take care of the children. So we see that in this type of society, men were trusted more than women, and they were treated as more smarter and more powerful beings. So at part 2 of the novel, we are introduced to Kabul City, which has a different social class and status of individuals, where as already mentioned, women have very little rights. But at the place where Mariam and Rasheed were staying together, it was a place called Demazang, which was mainly only for the lower to middle class. So at this city, we can see that there is some influence on Western culture and education, since at one point of the novel, Mariam and Rasheed walk past a street called Chicken Street, and Mariam sees modern Afghan women whom she envied. And this is because they did not wear burqas, these women, and they were not walking with their men, showing that they were gaining a bit more of an independence. So there is also the wealthy side of Kabul, which holds modern technology and education, whereas Rasheed says the rich kids get watches and leather bands, whereas the children in the poorer parts, which we refer to for Demazang, only could have old bicycle tires to play with. So we do get an idea of what the people of Kabul are like. As Jalil says in part 1 of the novel, he says the city had once been the cradle of Persian culture, the home of writers, painters, and Sufis. So in this particular quote, we can infer and imagine that the people of Kabul are very artistic and creative, where they get their main influence and traditional views from Persian culture. But in a physical description of Kabul City, we don't actually get an overview of what the city looks like, but we just get an idea of a specific street and a specific area. So we get an idea that Kabul is a much bigger city than Herat, but also in Demazang, when Mariam walks down the street for the first time with Rasheed, she describes that she sees narrow and unpaved roads. Houses on the roads were crowded together and share common walls with small yards. The houses had flat roofs and were made from bricks. So in this quote, we get an idea of what a couple of cities will look like, but also we can see that the cities are strongly based on the community since they're very crowded together. But we can also imagine that Kabul City is very frantic and crowded all the time, since by the idea that the houses are close together may show that the city is very populated. So some important things to note is that the setting of this book is trying to overall portray harsh conditions. And this is because, as mentioned in the first journal entry, one of the themes that it can develop from this is never giving up on hope. So some aspects of the setting that shows this idea is the fact that the setting is during times of conflict. It portrays hopeless times, but also there are very little rights for women. So we can see that the setting of the novel is during times of conflict, because throughout the entire plot of the novel, terrorist groups like the Taliban and foreign invaders like the Soviet Union is trying to overthrow the government and in conclusion take control of Afghanistan. So in part 2 of the novel, Babi, which is Lila's father, says, they learn to walk with a milk bottle in one hand and a gun in another. So in this particular quote, we see how the people's lives are starting to surround around war, where the future generations, such as the children, do not play with toys, but instead are holding guns. So this shows that the people of Afghanistan are in extreme conflict in this setting, and this is because they're in continuous fighting. So we see how the setting portrays hopeless times, because throughout the plot of the novel, we see how there are many deaths of families, friends, and relationships to the main protagonist because of being part of the violence, or unfortunately being caught in the crossfire and being victims of the power struggles between terrorist groups as well as foreign invaders. So in one particular quote said by Lila in part 4 of the novel, she says, Masood's violent ends brings her no joy, but she remembers too well the neighborhoods raised under his watch, the bodies dragged from the rubble, the hands and feet of children discovered on rooftops, or the high branches of some tree after days on their funeral. So this particular quote shows a hopeless setting because the citizens are being killed and are being victims to the conflict, where they're being caught in the crossfire. So we see that it's a very dehumanizing state because the citizens are not only living in fear because of the conflicts, but are also having and facing with deaths, which is a very tough form of hardship. So in the part of the novel where we see that women are receiving little rights, we can see this throughout the plot of the novel because women are treated as unequals in society, where they're being confined and restricted and also abused by their husband and society. So one very good example is Mariam's relationship with her husband Rasheed, where it's very abusive and there's a lot of violent methods and means going on in their relationship. But there's also one very good quote that shows how women are facing more hardship in this society, because in part 1 of the book, Mariam says, Mariam remembers how Nana says that each snowflake was a sigh heaved by an aggrieved woman somewhere in the road, as a reminder of how women like us suffer, how quietly we endure all these pain that falls upon us. So in this particular quote, we see how women have very little rights in the story, where because of this, they're constantly suffering and are facing extra hardships and troubles. All of these harsh conditions in the setting are purposeful because it helps develop one of the themes in this book, A Thousand Splendid Suns, to be that we should always rely on the hope to fight through and persevere through our problems and hardships. So it can help inspire us because of these harsh conditions in the setting, because we see how the people can overcome through these troubles. So it gives us hope that we can also do and fight our problems too. So there's one particular quote in the novel that expresses this idea, and it was said by Lila in part 4, and she says, every Afghan story is marked by death, loss, and unimaginable grief, and yet she still sees people finding a way to survive and to go on. So in this particular quote in the novel, it shows that Kabul city has a very dehumanizing setting where the people are faced with unprecedented and unimaginable circumstances, but they can still find a way to fight and to persevere through those problems, which yet again gives us the idea that the settings of harsh conditions were purposeful to give us the theme that there is hope and light, and that can help us fight through these problems. So we will now start talking about the moods in A Thousand Splendid Suns. So it's safe to claim that Khaled Hosseini was trying to aim for a very grim mood, but also a very inspiring attitude towards his themes. So we can see the grim moods through the different harsh conditions he had set for us. So we can also feel this inspiring attitude and motivation to fight through our adversities and problems, because in the book A Thousand Splendid Suns, towards the end of the novel, all adversities were overcome by the citizens of Kabul. So there are various ways in which Khaled Hosseini expresses these different moods, And one of the way that's already been mentioned is through the setting, but the other way is through Khaled Hosseini's choices of words. So Khaled Hosseini uses gruesome imagery to set the grim moods, which will then add on to the inspiring attitude towards the end, because we get an overall picture of the harsh conditions others have to overcome to make us feel inspired to fight through our problems too. The author also uses diction style, and Khaled Hosseini loves to use dark language, where he repeatedly uses the words like unloved. Other style is through syntax, where he uses shortened sentence grammar for suspense, but he also likes to use the native language of the Afghanistani people to make us feel more in Afghanistan, but also to depict character lives, as well as the fact that the weight of words are very different in different languages, and I'll get on more about that later on. So as an example to show how grim mood is expressed through dark imagery, it can be seen in this particular description where it says, Mariam caught a glimpse of what was beneath the tree, the straight-back chair overturned, the rope dangling from a high branch, Nana dangling at the end. So in this particular description, it shows the tragedy of Nana's death, where it uses dark imagery to create a grim mood and paint a picture, because in this particular scene, we get a point of view of what Mariam, which is a 14-year-old girl, has to see the suicide of her mother. So the other technique used by Khaled Hosseini to depict a grim feeling is through the use of the language in Afghanistan, where we see that he constantly uses the word harami to make us understand that Mariam was unwanted. But the use of native language adds to the effect of we get to understand what the language of Afghanistan people sound like, but we also get an understanding of how the characters felt, because the weight of certain words in one language means differently in another. So while harami translated in the English language just means to be unwanted, in the Afghanistan language, Khaled Hosseini mentions that harami is a very negative slur word, where it means to not only be unwanted, but it also means that the child is a disgrace, where they essentially will never be loved by anyone. So in the English language, this translated version only gives us a vague understanding of what the word such as harami meant. But when we understand what the true definition is and we get to see the actual word itself from that language, we understand what the characters must have felt when they heard the word. So an inspirational mood was felt through a combination of the techniques of the native language as well as the dark imagery, because the inspirational mood was only felt towards the end of the novel after all of the different hardships were faced. So, in conclusion, the main setting of A Thousand Splendid Suns is in Kabul, where we see that it's a city full of conflicts, gender inequalities, and hardships such as war and social class differentiation, but the people still manage to fight through those adversities and come out stronger and better than ever. But the writer also displays grim and inspiring moods through the use of dark imagery and native language. And this is to allow people to have a clearer image of the situation and have a better understanding of the situation. So thank you very much for listening. Bye.